Tonight's program, Gender, Sexuality, and Modern Design, features three speakers or participants: Mary McLeod, Jasmine Rawls, and Alice T. Friedman. The organization of this evening's program is as follows. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and I will introduce all of the speakers together at one time. And then Mary will begin, and each of the speakers will talk for a short time, I guess about 10 minutes or so, and then there'll be a discussion, and if time allows, I hope questions from the audience. I would like to begin, as I have with each of these events, to thank my colleagues in the audience: Hollis Barnhart, Grace, I don't know if you're here, Johnston, who is the head of marketing, Lindsay Lafreniere in our development office, Marianne LaMonica, chief curator, Caroline Hanna, associate curator, and Alexis Mucha, coordinator of rights and reproductions, all of whom traveled on the journey of the Artek exhibition with me, and I greatly appreciate your support. Our loyalists, return visitors, know that I always begin my introductions with whom I describe as our two protagonists, the architects Aino Aalto and Alvar Aalto. In 1960, approximately 2 decades after the untimely death of Aino Aalto, the publisher, Les Éditions d'Architecture Reproduction in Zurich, published the first volume of what became a 3-volume series of Aalto's complete works, authorized complete works, the last completed in 1976, shortly before his death. I refer to volume 1 in that series in the introduction to tonight's program because, to my knowledge, it is a rare documented instance of Aalto himself acknowledging how he worked with his collaborators, fellow architects. Aalto used 3 images in that introduction: a photograph of himself from 1930, we have it in the exhibition, a photograph of Aalto and his second wife, Alyssa, and a drawing of his first wife, Aino Aalto, that we also have in the exhibition. Accompanying these 3 illustrations was one sentence that reads, quote, "From 1924 to 1949, the architect Aino Aalto, and since 1952, the architect Alyssa Aalto, worked in partnership with Alvar Aalto," unquote. This brief but declarative statement of a partnership is rather surprising when considering how the rather extensive body of literature on Aalto has largely ignored any notion at all of partnership in the Aalto Architecture Office. In fact, the notion of partnership between Aalto and both of his architect wives has been a source of considerable confusion, misrepresentation, and marginalization in Finland. And outside of that country, it is little known. In fact, most people in this country don't know that Aalto worked with his wives, or that they were trained architects. It is little known that Marcio Aalto, who was Artek's first creative director, is a focus of our project, entered architecture school in 1913, that she had a rigorous training as an architect that included 2 internships, one with a bricklayer and one with a carpenter, all before 1920. Our study of Artek, although a corporate design history, provided evidence of how the partnership functioned and how the Aaltos identified themselves together as a creative partnership. From the moment of the founding of Artek in the fall of 1935, the Artek company graphic identity represented the Aaltos by name together. This was also how they identified themselves when Artek exhibited at the 1937 Paris exhibition, at the 1939 New York World's Fair. In fact, the American press became quite fixated on Marcio Aalto. The press clipping we have in the exhibition, and others we discuss in the book, the one in the exhibition from the New York Sun, actually dates to late in 1938, and it's interesting because most studies of the Aaltos say that she did not travel to the States for the first time with Alvar Aalto when she actually did. And that article portrayed Marcio Aalto as one of the first modern women. And they said that American women should literally emulate her. She was mother, wife of Alvar Aalto, and trained architect. Our exhibition has photos of Aino with her children, something rarely seen in architecture exhibitions as a way of representing her multiple identities that seem to have so impressed the American press. In fact, the exhibition does what I call inverting the normal, of representations in architecture exhibitions by foregrounding the components generally considered more feminine, you know what they are, interiors especially, while the plans, elevations, and sections, although carefully selected, are presented on digital screens. Several years ago, when I was first introduced to the Aalto's grandson, Henrik, he overtly expressed trepidation about being involved as a lender to Aalto exhibitions, that he said marginalized his grandmother. He told me most exhibitions, when they mention his grandmother at all, say she was a good amateur photographer, never an architect. He said to me, I'm interested in my grandparents' legacy, emphasis on the plural, as an architect. The Artek exhibition became the exhibition that it is today, as far as loans are concerned, when I convinced him, after several tries, I am also interested in that legacy. The connection between Alvar and Aino Aalto in the architecture exhibition builds upon the pioneering research of Renjer Soimen-Kokkonen, who began publishing on Marcio Aalto in the 1990s. And although since then others have given greater credence to Marcio Aalto, she continues to be under-recognized. In the US, for example, you might know of Sarah Menin's work that questions how Marcio Aalto was egregiously portrayed by Joran Schilt, Aalto's biographer. Schilt, the source of what is most widely used in studies of Aalto, described Marcio Aalto as having limited creative abilities, inadequate drafting skills, and perhaps most egregiously, he focused on what he perceived as her physical faults, being overweight, as the most prevalent one. When I embarked on this project, I was hopeful, but I actually did not fully understand the degree to which a study on Artek could dispel myths about the partnership and provide evidence of Marcio Aalto's identity as an architect, as well as Artek's creative director, and in the 1940s, shortly before she died, as both creative and executive director of Artek. The abundance of archival material and the ability to simultaneously, and this is a critical distinction of this project, simultaneously examine and interpret the materials in both the Alvar Aalto and Artek archives enables reinstating Marcio Aalto in the literature. The New York Sun was absolutely correct when it identified Marcio Aalto as a model of the modern woman, and she demands our long overdue consideration. The three participants in this evening's program have contributed substantially to what Janet Wolfe, the British cultural historian, has explained as the need to reinstate women in the historical narrative of design and architecture. Mary McLeod, I don't know if she remembers, who I first met in 1985, when she read my master's thesis on Charlotte Perriand, and our paths first crossed over Perriand, is a trained architect and architectural historian. She studied at Princeton and is a professor of architecture at Columbia. Mary McLeod has published widely in many of the leading architectural journals, Assemblage, Positions, Lotus, among many others. Her scholarly interests that have been a great inspiration to me frequently focus on women's issues, and she has been a contributor to books that address them, such as Ideological Equals, Women Architects in Socialist Europe, 1945 to 1989, The Sex of Architecture, and Modern Women, Women Artists at the Museum of Modern Art. Jasmine Ralt is Assistant Professor of Culture and Media at the Eugene Lang College of the New School here in New York. Her first book in 2011, Eileen Gray and the Design of Sapphic Modernity, Staying In, exemplified her interest in themes of feminist and queer architecture and design. Ralt is currently at work on 2 book projects. The title, Checking In, Feminist and Queer Labor in New Worked Economies, a book she is co-authoring with T.L. Cowan, and the second title, Unsettling Affects, Queer Creative Activism in the Americas. Finally, our third participant, Alice Friedman, I have to say I've kept her book on my desk while I was working on this project, is the Grace Slack McNeil Professor of the History of American Art and Director of the McNeil Program of Studies in American Art at Wellesley. She's a prolific author and commentator on issues related to feminism and architecture. Among her essays, there are many, are Queer and Old Things, Glamour, Memory, and Spatial Imagination of 2015, and Women in the Making of the Modern House, that book of 2014. All three of our participants have contributed substantially to our understanding of gender and architecture and have elucidated the critical issues of sexual divisions in these fields. So I welcome first Mary McLeod.
Thanks, and I have to thank Melissa Gerstein for organizing this amazing series, and I'm just delighted and honored to be part of the last of these events. And of course, to Nina Stritzler-Levine for this amazing show. It's really beautiful, intelligent. I don't know if you read Roberta Smith's review, but I think she said something that so few people kind of understand is even possible in a design or architecture exhibit, that one can be both scholarly, intelligent, as well as aesthetically pleasing. And for me, this show is a beautiful example of that. So I was just thrilled when I saw it. I'm going to do a rather sort of broad, swift overview. I hope I don't go on too long. I better watch my watch. It will not deal so specifically with Aino Aalto, but I hope so much that we can relate the themes that I bring up to her in the discussion. Women architects and modern architecture might seem like a contradiction in terms. We're used to these heroic figures. We have Gropius, Corbusier, Nice, all with their models, looming forth. And of course, there are slews of secondary figures, whether we're talking about Aud, Lopsa, Turani. And for many years, as Nina said, we thought of Aalto or Frank Lloyd Wright in that same category. In fact, a kind of stereotype, in a way related to a kind of very important essay by Andreas Husson, was that modernism was primarily male, autonomous, pure, austere, and that women were somehow linked with mass culture, commercial, the decorative, the secondary. But I would like, if possible, to complicate that model a bit. The first thing, of course, is that modern architecture was very interested in mass culture. Some of it, of course, seemed like it was very male, airplanes, cars, etc. But very curiously, in the middle of his chapter on airplanes and Towards a New Architecture, Le Corbusier writes a manual of the dwelling. And he addresses this manual specifically to the woman. The woman should demand a bathroom looking south, an adjoining room where you can dress and undress, a very large living room, etc., built-in vacuum cleaning, we could go on. And in fact, I want to kind of show that it was in that section of airplanes, but that even cars could be associated with the new woman, or someone like Le Corbusier himself in his book Radiant City. I'm giving you the English translation there, where he's actually citing a woman's magazine, suggesting that new social customs come from women that escape hypocrisy and social conventions. And I'll be arguing something like that. One of the things I think it's important to realize is that there were women architects and designers in the 20s and the 30s. And in fact, they were often much more recognized then than they were later in the 50s, 60s, and certainly by the Museum of Modern Art, which Julia Kitchen in the audience can attest to. We still struggle with that issue a bit. Why were they entering the profession? They had begun to enroll in schools in the US and Scandinavia, certainly already in the US quite early, in Scandinavia by the end of the 19th century, in Germany by the beginning of the century. Certainly, new social mores allowed women to work, World War I being a major turning point. The collaborative nature of architecture, I think, also allowed women to become involved, and sometimes to their own detriment, because those collaborations often underplayed their role. And finally, I think many of these new women in the post-World War I period were excited about how architecture and design might bring a new way of living. And they brought new interests and skills. And before we get there, I should say, and I'll try to tackle what I think are three areas where they play a major role, and I'll be focusing on housing. That may seem, and I think this is one of the issues we can deal with at the end in the discussion, is to what extent modern architecture, because it opens the field, extends its definition to housing, allows women to extend their traditional realm into a professional realm. To what extent is it containing women, or have the hierarchies between public and private in fact been reversed, or are somewhat undermined in this kind of thing that happens in the modern movement in the 20s and 30s. The three scales I want to look at very quickly are furniture, or what Perriand will call interior equipment. Two, domestic arrangements, rationalization, focusing on the kitchen. And third, large-scale housing and urban configurations and how women were involved with that. And I'll be focusing primarily on three women, not Aino, but I think she actually affects each one of those three realms, and I hope Nina can elaborate further on that. Charlotte Perriand, Gertrude Lohotsky, and Elizabeth Denby, an English woman. And we have Aino, of course, Lily Reich, and Eileen Gray, whom we'll hear more about, I know, from Jasmine. Okay, to look at the first area, furnishings, or what Perriand liked to call interior equipment. I mentioned that women enter the field, and many women come through the decorative arts and architecture, where they were often more accepted in schools, certainly the case in France. And one of those young women, and she was very young when she knocked on Corbusier's door, she was 24, was Charlotte Perriand. And in fact, he turned her down. Many of you have probably heard this anecdote. He said, "We don't embroider cushions, in my office." And she was very persistent. And he actually somehow got talked into seeing her display at the 1927 Salon d'Automne. And there he's at her display, which you see right here, striking at this moment in France for using tubular chrome, tubular steel, and sort of slick modern furnishings. He hires her very soon thereafter, later in the year, 27, and immediately puts her to work with a project to design basic types of furniture. He does what he calls machines for sitting. He does a kind of sketch like this, and he puts her to work where she starts working with models, thinking about what the chairs might be. And the result are three chairs where the authorship is usually credited to Le Corbusier, Pierre Jeanneret, and Charlotte Perriand. In fact, she said, we worked as three fingers on one hand. It was very collaborative, with Corbusier setting the parameters, Pierre helping with working drawings. Perriand was still learning how to do architectural drawings, but Perriand herself actually getting them made, manufactured, choosing the materials, finding the artisans, and really the final result of the objects are very much hers. This is the first chair, this chaise basculant, where in fact we get rid of upholstery, but she sees it as having both a set form and some variety. But what I think is interesting is to compare it to other modern furniture, which also, I would suggest, obliterates traditional gender associations. On the one moment, it's strong, tough metal. On the other hand, it's light and graceful. In the case of Perriand's designs, I always think it's more a smaller size, not quite as sort of, you don't imagine a sort of heavy big man in it. On the other hand, even other modern furniture, such as Breuer's club chair, we see photographs of the period, you know, this great famous image with both male and female, suggesting something about the challenge to traditional imagery, gender associations. And the same comes with what's called the Grand Confort, where instead of the traditional male club chair, chair in a British men's club, we have a chair that you can imagine easily both sexes on. And finally, the chaise longue, often seen as very feminine, associated with like the Duchesse Brisée or a Duchesse Thonay, but also Morris's more kind of heavier chair, or this sur repos doctor's chair. Ironically, perhaps, or paradoxically, Perriand and Corbu both talked about a man in this chair. Corbusier said he imagined a cowboy putting his legs, smoking his pipe, and putting his legs up on a fireplace. Perriand said she imagined a soldier with his legs against a tree and his knapsack behind his head. But the picture they publish, of course, it's this famous, beautiful image of Perriand herself on the chair, a photograph she set up with Pierre Jeanneret when Corbusier was in South America, and both Corbusier and she use it in their own publicity. And finally, they display the pieces in a design when Corbusier is in South America, Perriand did the plan, in their model dwelling of what a new family, a servantless household, might have. And again, traditional gender associations, I would suggest, get obliterated in this new language that is both light and strong, easy to clean, but also a bit too avant-garde, probably for the average lower middle class, working class, or even middle class person. Do you all know what that curved thing is? Anyone guess? Shower. Well, you sit in the living room and you can see people getting in and out. Only the sort of central part is covered. Okay, and more images. And I just wanted to mention Perriand herself writes about the chair, uses this image, and she got livid at me when I mentioned one theorist's interpretation that this image was denying her authorship. She was so angry. She said, "You Americans, what's wrong with you?" It wasn't me, but she thought it was. And she said, "I just didn't want to show my face. I wanted to emphasize the chair." I can't help but think she was being a bit flirtatious, too. Okay, second thing, kitchens. Rationalization. And I'm going to just show you that this actually emerges from women who are not architects, and the original origins, I would suggest, are American and come to Europe after World War I. Many of you know Catherine Beecher's work, and then the book she did with her sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, in the 1860s, showing already continuous countertops, storage built in, trying to organize the kitchen in a more rational form. The book, though, that really influenced the Europeans was a book by Christine Frederick in 1913 called New Housekeeping. And this famous diagram she did showing the traditional kitchen versus a well-designed kitchen, of course on the right, became a drawing that gets reproduced again and again in Europe. Her book gets translated by the German Irina Witte, also translated into French a bit later. This diagram, in fact, gets used as early as 1924 by Bruno Taut in his book about the new way of living, which he dedicates to the woman creator. I mentioned also Erna Meyer, who published a book on housekeeping in 1926. and that went into 29 editions in 2 years. The sort of figure for 1 second that we'll look at is Marguerite Schut-Lohotsky, an amazing woman that Ernst May hires, offering her, he claimed, double her salary that she was making if she would come work with him. And she was a very popular figure, drawn, songs, poems about her, really became a kind of symbol of this new professional woman. She herself claimed she had never cooked before she designed the Frankfurt kitchen, and she saw it as a kind of job. She put Irina Witta's translation of Christine Frederick, she claims, on her drawing board, looked at things like railroad cars, places where people worked efficiently. And she designed 3 model kitchens. They have variations, but the one that is most famous is the Frankfurt kitchen, the first model, which was meant for those without much money, no servants, and the woman, it was assumed would be a woman in the kitchen, would sit on a stool and could basically do much of the functions looking out the window. I should mention a couple of innovations. Her goal was really to eliminate work. She saw cooking as work, anything, whether it was male or female, to reduce work and allow people more time to develop themselves. And she actually put women's self-fulfillment before even family was critical. And I mentioned things like the heat box, where a woman, if she did work, could put in, it's like our slow cooker, could have it next to the stove, and it could be kept warm and cooked slowly. Here you see the famous image. Electricity was expensive. You could pull it back and forth, the rotating stool. And notice too, the dishes, you didn't have to dry dishes. She had a dish rack. And the beautifully designed canisters out of aluminum, where you didn't have to pour the flour out of a can, you could pour it directly into a measuring cup, saving women's labor. There's a little anecdote there. The kids liked to play with them a little too much, so she had to move up the canisters and in the later renditions of the kitchen. Anyway, just an image of rationalization. They did films of it, lots of publicity of the Frankfurt kitchen. And she also, one of the big themes about rationalization, if you apply the methods of rationalization, you're changing again gender. The notion that housework is something, it can be professional. It can be serious, rational, organized, efficient, and in fact, people would be trained in how to be more efficient in these classes in Frankfurt. And here you see a classroom about home economics. I'm going to skip through these. There was a French equivalent, and I just would show you here. Perriand, very influenced. Corbu had seen the Frankfurt kitchen, got excited. He'd been totally uninterested in kitchens, and put Perriand to work always when he had a kitchen to design. And one of the points I would like to make is not only did it improve and eliminate drudgery for household work, but it also challenged what architects thought was acceptable to show. Corbusier, for instance, had never published a kitchen before Perriand joined the office. He publishes this canonical image of Villa Savoie's kitchen, and then when he publishes his own kitchen, which he had Perriand design in Nongazé et Colli, he includes his lovely wife, Yvonne, in her modern slacks in this kitchen. Okay, I'm too long. Quickly, the last point I want to make is that this concern about housing extended beyond furniture and the kitchen to actually a notion of public life. And a figure that represents that is Elizabeth Denby in England. She went to London School of Economics, had worked in charity, was not trained as an architect, but called herself somewhat akin to Catherine Bauer, a housing consultant. There she is in the 40s. Her goal was that if you designed efficient housing that was very attentive to women's needs and family needs, women would be freed of much domestic labor and able to engage in public life. She collaborated with Maxwell Fry, the British architect, on this amazing housing project, which is still in relatively good shape in London, in Ladbroke Grove, called the Kensal House, which was sponsored by the Gas and Coke Company. Here are recent photos. And what was interesting is that she not only insisted on very efficient units, but she insisted on public amenities. But I should just say, among the efficient units, places for strollers and baby carriages on the ground level, large enough balconies so women or men could hang laundry, children could play out there. They're amazingly efficient in terms of daily life. But she also was very interested in childhood education and working with some consultants, insisted on having a nursery school. They got funding from Greater London County Council. And one of the amazing things is this nursery school that was part of the project open from 8 to 5, so mothers could have time to enjoy club activities, community meetings, participate in public life, or if they worked, of course, had childcare, swimming pool, playrooms, medical facilities, a sand pit, etc. And every detail was kind of worked out, even places for all the kids to hang their clothes, etc. Another important part of this project was that there were clubs, collective amenities, where women and men, again still sex segregated, although in the evening it was hoped that they would meet together for political and community meetings, but women could take sewing classes, men could do carpentry, they could also go to these club spaces for tea or more relaxed events. And eventually, she decided that high-rise housing was not ideal, and I would like to say that she anticipates in some ways the sort of position of Jane Jacobs about traditional urban living as a model of community and really the low-rise, high-density models that were so big in the late 60s and 70s among urbanists as a model of living. Again, very attentive to women and family needs, kitchens that overlook the street for deliveries, to watch kids playing in the street, spacious gardens with living rooms overlooking them. The point I'm really trying to make is that women brought attention to the domestic realm. Modern architecture allowed for that, but I also think in a very deep way they contributed to it becoming more important and challenging really the hierarchies of building types and the boundaries of the profession itself.
Okay, thanks so much for coming and for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here, and really just thrilled especially to hear Mary and Alice's work. They're both, of course, huge influences on my own research, so it's sort of thrilling to be here with them. And it's great to see everybody here, and great to have seen the exhibition, which if you haven't seen already, I mean, I'm sure most of you have, but if you haven't, you really should go see it. It's an unusual, it's a unique exhibition, and quite beautiful. Okay, I'm just going to get right into my talk, and I'm going to be less chatty and more ready, but I'll do my best to, be here. So my research on early 20th century interior design and architecture starts with what might seem like a coincidence. So many women working in design at the time, especially in Europe, UK, and the US, would now be included somewhere in the LGBTQ acronym. We can think of Eileen Gray, the focus of most of my research, who we see on the left, as well as her design partner, Evelyn Wild, who we see on the right. And then, Evelyn Wild's designing partner, Elizabeth Erdelan, how do we say this, Erdelanus? We see them together on the left, and then Erdelanux by herself on the right. Along with people like Phyllis Barron and Dorothy Larcher, Enid Marco Marx, and her design partner, Margaret Lambert, who I don't have a photo of, Nora Braden and Catherine Plato-Bouverie. We see Nora Braden on the right and the two of them together on the left. Ada Peter Mason, who I don't have a photo of. Constance Spry, Elsie de Wolf. We saw on the right Elsie de Wolf with Bessie Marbury, who she lived with for the majority of her life, and sort of started her design work and her design career living together with her. Mary Laurencin, we see on the left, and some of her artwork on the right of her. She loved to paint dancers and to also do designs for dance sets and dance performances. Marianne Dorn, we see some of her rug designs on the right. Her designs were quite comparable to Evelyn Wild's. Betty Joel, Siri Mom, and design historian Margaret Jourdain, as well as Anne Macbeth from the Glasgow School of Art. Moreover, if we extend our scope to include women who dedicated significant creative and critical energy to modernist reconfigurations of domestic space and design, we can count people like visual artists like Romaine Brooks and Gluck. We have Romaine Brooks' self-portrait on the left from 1926 and a photo of Gluck from 1927 on the right. The photo of Gluck doesn't come out too clearly, but it's reproduced a lot, so it might be familiar to you. On the one hand, we have the intuitive explanation that women were, especially at the time, understood as somehow inherently oriented towards interior design and domestic arts. And so this work would not have chafed too much against social conventions of femininity. On the other hand, we have the historical fact that many of these women did not enter or go into formal architectural education in the countries where they lived or worked. And so some historians have concluded that they worked in design as the next best and closest thing to architecture. So I've been more compelled by the historical convergence of interests in interiors, interiority, interior space, and domesticity at the time, so that entering into the practice of interior design meant entering into a field of discourse that included the new sciences of psychology, sexology, psychoanalysis and medicine, domestic education, sociology and social hygiene, architecture, urban planning, and engineering. That is, each of these specialized fields were developing techniques and knowledges for how best to optimize the health of modern interiors and to cultivate optimal modern bodies and subjects. At the same time, a subset of mostly economically and culturally privileged, primarily white women, were cultivating a version of optimal modern subjectivity that included modes of gender and sexual dissidence that would eventually become associated with the sexual identity lesbian. That is, up until the late 20s, the performance of gender and sexual dissidence was consistent with the performance of a particularly racialized and classed artistic avant-garde or modern identity. These get referred to as studies in Sapphic, this era gets referred to as Sapphic modernity, right? So studies in Sapphic modernity show that the discrete sexual identity, lesbian, emerged as a result of a wide circulation of photographs of Radcliffe Hall during the mass media coverage of her 1928 obscenity trials over her book, The Well of Loneliness. After the trial, various forms of female gender and sexual creativity, from female masculinity, sort of overproduced femme fierceness, to same-sex intimacy, which had been read as signs of modernity, were in fact reduced to one static lesbian identity, to be either pathologized or championed. Options that did not seem to appeal to any of the designers, writers, or visual artists that I've studied. That is, the possibility of a particularly racialized and classed modern identity and understanding of modernity, ultimately connected to dissident gender and sexuality, was lost when the modern lesbian was formed. We might say that before 1928, there was no such sexual identity. No series of acts, desires, or discourses had yet cohered into a recognizable subject or type of person known as the lesbian. Joanne Winning locates the culture of Sapphic modernity in what she calls a slippery space between clear intelligibility, comprised of what she calls a mixture of possibility and closure, dissolution and formation, where dissident identities are to be inaugurated. It's not just this slippage, this tending towards dissolution, but exactly this that creates the space in which formations of identity and experience may be rested and lived out. So my work has suggested that these women designed to protect and cultivate this slippery space, for modernity constituted on the possibility of open, unformed, unfixed sexual dissidence. So this angle on gender and sexual resonances of modern design and architecture was particularly invigorated for me by the work of Eileen Gray and the now well-known story of Le Corbusier's peculiar attention to her first built house, E1027. By the time I read Beatrice Colomina's 1996 essay, Colomina's specter has been already raised in the room, by the time I read her essay, Battle Lines, E1027, where she suggests that Le Corbusier's obsessive, sexualized, and aesthetic violence against Gray's intricately designed house was related to Gray's being, quote, openly gay, my research imagination was fully piqued. How did Gray design some threatening gayness into her house to provoke Le Corbusier's disciplinary violences? How would a house communicate sexuality? What would it mean to communicate female non-heterosexuality at a time before the word lesbian had accrued a stable referent, when female masculinities and same-sex desire were not yet read as indications of identity? And does this disciplinary reaction to some kind of dissident sexuality give us some clue as to why so many non-heterosexual women turned their energies to interior design at the start of the 20th century? I just have a couple of photos of the interior of Gray's house. I'm going to come back to that, interior of E1027, and then some photos that I took in 2005 with Le Corbusier's, one of Le Corbusier's murals, and the house itself totally gutted. It's been restored now. And then Le Corbusier painting one of the murals. And then just a nice view from the front of E1027. If you're at all familiar with the revolutionary fervor and utopian tenor of much modernist architectural rhetoric, you've already gleaned that there was more at stake in debates about buildings, furnishings, and their design than style alone. Early 20th century modernist architects like Theo van Doesburg extolled modern architecture's creation of, quote, a radical change in the way of life. While explaining the virtues of new abstract interior design, Piet Mondrian exclaimed, "Such rooms call for a new people," and ultimately to a new beauty corresponds a new man. Walter Gropius described the psychological benefits, and Peter Behrens the psychological delight of modern architecture. So modernist architects and designers were reforming not just buildings, but the occupants of those buildings as well. The question of health was central to these occupants' reform, and the design of a house became the design of an inhabitable form of physical and psychological therapy. That is, early 20th century architects inherited from late 19th century psychology, sexology, and decorative art the understanding that architectural and interior design was invested with the power to physically and psychologically change people. By the early 20th century, Adolf Loos could famously declare that ornament was both the effect and cause of degeneration, at that point a sort of code word for homosexuality as well. And Le Corbusier could soberly explain, contemporary society, at present so sick, has become properly aware that only architecture can provide the exact prescription for its ills. By the early 20th century, a convergence of physical and psychological therapy, sexology, decorative arts, enabled modern architects and designers to imagine themselves, along with a nexus of legal and medical professionals, to be in the business of making healthy bodies. As Michel Foucault reminds us, the importance of sex in definitions of health and healthy bodies since the 19th century cannot be underestimated. The modern project of producing healthy bodies was also the project of regulating and producing sexuality. Undertaking the challenge of modernizing domestic space would have also meant entering into this volatile field of discourse, and so promised the opportunity to intervene in early 20th century definitions and regulations of new modern bodies, sexuality, gender, and subjectivity. If Sapphic modernity is characterized by putting the possibility of sexual dissidence at the center of the modern, there was perhaps no better way to undertake such an endeavor than by reconceiving and redesigning domestic living spaces. Moreover, if the sexual dissidence was importantly not reducible to sexual identity, there is perhaps no better media through which to enable such an unformed and suggestive sense of possibility than the non-representational and indeterminate but highly sentient and physically affective media of interior design. That is, while interior design and architecture are unmistakably communicative, they do not represent anything other than what they are, unlike, say, writing, painting, or photography, which carry the specter of a referent of speech, subject, and objects. Insofar as it had the capacity to refer to no thing, but was simultaneously vested at this historical moment in time with the potential power to create new modern things, bodies and subjects, interior design was perfectly poised to generate that slippery space of Sapphic modernist becoming. And so answering some of the questions I pose above about the challenging role of non-heterosexuality in Gray's E1027 meant for me including architecture and design in the history of sexuality and biopolitics as a volatile site of discipline, regulation, and contestation of interiority itself. It also meant understanding Gray's work in a different context, not only in relation to the major male architects of her time, but importantly in conversation with other women who were reconceptualizing, reimagining, and redesigning interiors. So I studied Gray's early folding screens in relation to Romaine Brooks's use of screens and the ways that Brooks, in her paintings, worked to perform her own versions of masculinity and stage scenes of sapphic erotic intimacy. So there's a painting by Romaine Brooks, and then there's a couple by Eileen Gray, a much larger lacquer screen. I read these together to think through forms of sexuality and gender in the book. I focused on E1027 in relation to Radcliffe Hall's banned book, The Will of Loneliness, published in 1928, that's the same year Gray finished her house, to show that Gray was designing spaces for precisely the exiles that Hall described as desperately searching appropriately designed interiors to shelter their queer genders, sexualities, and socialities. So there's Gray's interior of E1027 again. Yeah. And I studied the complex contours of privacy that Gray designed in her 1934 house, Tampapaya, which we see here, in conversation with Juna Barnes's novel, Nightwood, which was published 2 years after Tampapaya was completed, and Nightwood, renowned for its densely complicated and opaque evocations of female intimacy, interiority, and queer desires. Indeed, breaking up the clarity of communication, designing sensually rich spaces for visual and physical privacy, generated possibilities for bodies and pleasures whose incommunicability or refusal to public intelligibility seemed designed to evade the discursive reach of power, knowledge, pleasure that so much of the field of early 20th century modernity was invested in. I do a long, drawn-out reading of this house, based a lot on Eileen Gray's own photographs of the house that delay and delay and delay the entrance to the house. We get this kind of blocked facade again and again. We don't know where the house starts. She has this choreographed entrance into the house that takes you round and round it. We have a sense of all the ways that she was deferring access to privacy in this way that to me is quite resonant. So this work led me to see that the sapphic modernity Gray designed was not unlike the work of so many of her female contemporaries in its cultivation of ambiguity in the face of a pressure towards communicative clarity, the persistent attachment to signs of perversely outdated or primitive aesthetics and cultural reference, and an insistence on interiorization rather than exteriorization, on complex folds of privacy rather than public-facing statements, on staying in rather than coming out.
I'm so happy to be here to see all of you, see so many of my friends and people who have influenced me in my thinking and in the way that I look at these issues. And like Mary and Jasmine, happy to be on this program with my fellow speakers because I've learned so much from them. And I think I take credit for the discovery of Jasmine's work, which I think is fantastic. I know I shouldn't take credit for it, but I'm just so happy to, hear what you have to say. And in fact, in thinking about your work in particular and Mary's, I was really very much taken by this idea of the woman architect as a designer of interiors, as reshaping the domestic realm and the boundaries of the profession, as Mary said, but also, as Jasmine said, this idea of a difference between women architects and women clients in particular of different sexualities, and trying to work out contexts and categories to understand that, particularly in relationship to the exhibition and to the work of Alvar and Aino. I was thinking about power couples and the ways in which couples within modernism, particularly straight, white, wealthy couples, or in other ways, couples with agency, have one way of thinking, whereas, as Jasmine pointed out, one way of thinking, designing, and then this other emphasis on privacy and the hiding of private life. Of course, the Villa Mairea is an example of the work of a power couple, designed by a power couple and commissioned by a power couple, with a woman, Maya Gulchin, as the leader of that work. She herself was part of a wealthy industrious family, so we have this issue of class. She studied art in Paris in 1925 to 28, in a very different realm from the people that we just saw depicted. She married Harry Gulchin in 1928. In 1935, she established an art school in Helsinki, and of course, as we know, and as the exhibition beautifully pointed out, she, with Niels Gustav Hall and the Aaltos, was a prime mover in the founding of Artek. She was particularly interested in running an art gallery and patronage of art, but what I'm interested in particular in looking at her, is a sort of antithesis between the kinds of thinking and the kinds of public endeavors that she was able to carry out, and those of queer artists and queer subjects, whose work, has nothing whatsoever to do with this sort of spectacular demonstration of the possibilities of modernism. That context for the patronage, I think, helps us a great deal to understand a house like this, but also a house like Falling Water or the Tugendhat House, which we think of as icons of modernism, not as experimental houses, not as housing, but despite the fact that Meyer made a claim or felt that this house of hers was an experiment in modern living, a laboratory of sorts in which things can be done that would be impossible with present-day mass production. So in this case, I think the context helps us see that this is a high-budget, standalone representation of modernism within the context of a high-budget patronage with luxury materials and furnishings, and the sense of the spatial articulation of the identity of the bourgeois individual. So gender certainly plays a very strong role here. We have the foregrounding of the pavilion in which the meeting room and the study of Harry Gulchin is located, and then of course on the other side the foregrounding of the atelier of Meyer herself, who was a painter and continued painting. This house is located in Western Finland, far in the country. I mean, it's, we could just sit and look at pictures of it endlessly, and I think that's sort of the point. It's not about the secret, it's not about inversion, interiority. It's, I think, a very spectacular and rich evocation of the possibilities of modern living at a certain budget and for a certain class of people. As I say, it's located in Western Finland. It is in a rural location because it was associated with the industry of the family, and other members of the Alstrom family had built houses here as well, as many of you already know. It foregrounds the sort of, and we can look at it in terms of the foregrounding of this synthesis of modernism and nature, the machine aesthetic and the natural aesthetic, and of course, when we go around, there's the studio atelier again on the far right. When we go around to the side where the pool is, this synthesis of organic and machine, I think, is brought to this sort of beautiful resolution, but also the fixing of this house within the tradition of Nordic living, and through the sauna and the outdoor fireplace and the dining area, all of which, you know, say a great deal about the way in which the house positions itself. There's nothing recessive about it. So in my current thinking about clients and the ways in which they shape new conceptions of domesticity, what concerns me are questions like, what are the boundaries and the thresholds between private and public? What is the use of the places? When we actually look at the Villa Maria, it's in fact, despite this claim of being a laboratory for modern living, it doesn't shift the conventions of domesticity particularly. There are some ways that the sightlines, but I would be very interested to hear people's take on that as well. I've written a great deal about single women and women heads of households as shifting the domestic program towards a certain kind of hybridity. And, you know, I think that helps us to see a house like this as a clear demonstration of the formal languages of modernism and not so much this sort of ideologies on politics of modernism. What is the function and narrative of these interiors, the private space or secret space? In this case, the atelier is a private space for the articulation of the subject, but not in any way forced to or conceived within a context of discrimination in which the sexualized or queer or interior is at the core. Here, I think we could say there's a gendered interior within a context of heteronormativity. We have a normalization of the domestic program, and also, you know, I've done a small amount of research on the context of Finnish politics of queer definition in this period, and it's in the context of not surprisingly, of the sort of generalized homophobia that was current throughout European culture. So here we have a kind of exteriorized modernism that's polemical, theatrical, and I think very importantly photogenic, versus a kind of interior modernism. So I would distinguish this house with its beautiful, you know, kind of exteriors, its beautiful polemical performance from what I'm calling poker-faced houses. Houses that don't give anything away, or domiciles that don't give anything away, in which, as we just heard, you know, the interior is embedded in a either in an apartment house where there's no ability to distinguish that domicile from any other from the street, we think of Stein, we think of Natalie Barney, all of these famous modern women back in their Parisian apartment houses or in the courtyards of apartment houses. There's lots of other ways, and we could talk more about that, in which the Poker Face House, I think, as really an alternative to the kind of spectacular modernism that we all know and love. Just to look, because it's so beautiful, briefly at the house, you know, we see that it actually is a, not just an exterior, but an interior that frames the performative, in which the craft of the organic in relation to the machine is foregrounded in a way that was really the great, I think, one of the great contributions of the Aaltos. And here, in contrast to the atelier, we see the study of Harry Gulshan and the meeting room, which this was sometimes used as for sort of meetings that had to do with the business. Polite activities of the haute bourgeois household, the performance of music, the hanging of works of art. And when I don't want to take too much time because you're all familiar with these icons of modern architecture that I would, put in many categories, but one category at the present time is the result of these sort of power couples as patrons. At Falling Water, we see Edgar, Lillian, and Edgar Jr., the clients of this house, department store owners. They too made a claim for their home as an experiment, right? It was used, we never see it published. It's interesting that Mary talked about the publication of kitchens. We hardly ever see the publication of the kitchen in the Villa Mairea. It isn't a house that I think is engaged in this whole dialogue about work at all. I mean, the patrons had nothing to do with work, and so really it is about this action. Pardon?
They had servants.
Yeah, exactly.
But the Steins did have their kitchen published.
The
Michael
Villa
Stein.
Stein. Yes, oh, absolutely. But I think that was as a result of the kinds of dialogues within the office that you were talking about, right? That house is seen also as a demonstration, right? Michael Stein says, we're going to do the same thing for architecture that we did for painting, right? He is a patron. I'm talking on both sides of my mouth, of course, because it's a whole chapter about in women and making the modern house as well. The Kaufmans wanted to show the use of new technologies in the kitchen, things that they had for sale in the department store that they ran. But they're here, again, I think what we're talking about in this case, as in the Villa Mairea, is about the poetics of modernism and not the polemics so much. And of course, photography helps us with our longing, I think, for these poetics, our love of these poetics. And here, as with the Villa Mairea, I mean, there's a conjunction between the two. There's a beautiful synthesis of modernist vocabularies with natural or organic and craft, and the sort of the local versus the international. But at no point in this beautiful house is there a challenge to the nature of domesticity, I would say. And it's just important, I think it's helpful for us to understand it, to understand the body of work of the Aaltos for the most part, and to understand Wright's work for the most part, as belonging to a category of architectural production, and point to the role of these power couple clients, but make it a very firm distinction based on gender, race, and class about what was possible and what's being done. And I think in some ways the most beautiful of all of these spectacular theatrical houses is Mrs. Tungenhut House at Brunn, a little bit earlier than the two that we just looked at, for Fritz and Greta Tungenhut. Again, beautifully photographed, entered from the, missed one. Oh, there we are. The street level entrance versus the private garden that we've been looking at, street level entrance. And then when we look at these amazing spaces, I think it helps us as historians to understand them in terms of the bourgeois practices. And the Tungenhut, Greta Tungenhut in particular, in her essay on how does one actually live in a modern house, was very clear about the aesthetics rather than the politics. There's the study and a dark room, but for the most part, I think it's about the pleasures and the poetics of architecture. The boudoir, these beautiful juxtapositions of craft and mass production here as well. Brought to life, and of course architecture is so different from other media, brought to life through the agency of patrons, not clients in this case, patrons who, as we know from Falling Water, and the kind of bromance of Frank Lloyd Wright and Edgar Kaufman, that takes a certain kind of dedication, and the Steins, I would say, as well. Just to finish up, I return to my favorite juxtaposition between the Farnsworth House and Philip Johnson's Glass House. In this example, which I've obsessively returned to over and over and over again, I think one of the reasons that it's such a demonstration of the perfection of modernist form is that the program is so minimalized, right? That the client, it's a weekend house for a single woman doctor client. And there's endless discussion we could have about the ways in which she is, or claimed to be, erased by this house. The house, she said, was like an X-ray, for example. But beautiful. And then here at New Canaan, I think Johnson, in his quirky way, his quirky, insistent, unpleasant way, creates an essay on this very topic, right? For me, in my thinking about Poker Faces, the glass house, which we all know and love, paired with the brick house, right? What is the nature of domesticity? What is the nature of privacy? What are the boundaries and thresholds? So of course, we have this house in which the kitchen is a counter worthy of the Catherine Beecher. It's a counter that disappears basically within the glass box. Going back to the plan, you all know it very well. The functional aspects of dressing and undressing in your bedroom, the hygiene of the modern house, all of that is sort of pushed to the side, I think, in an effort to create an essay about minimal domesticity, but only when it's paired, and an essay, I think, also about craft, and American tradition in relation to Mises' far more elegant, formalized modernism. But when we look at the brick house, the ultimate poker face house, when I was working on it a long, long time ago, started working on this material, someone said to me, well, it's just like a gay bar in a urban, gritty neighborhood. It is a completely banal brick facade that you can't tell anything that's going on. from the exterior, and of course, you know, paired with the glass house, neither of which are architecturally as beautiful as any of the buildings that we've looked at, architecturally as resolved, but that's a longer conversation, I think, also. But inside, of course, we have this private, sexualized world with the low bed, the ottoman, the soft surfaces, the Fortuny silk, which you could, I guess, maybe you can no longer see in the ladies' room at the Four Seasons because they're ripping it up, but that's the same silk there, this sort of pinky gray that they use there and is used here, interestingly enough. You know, the false arches, the insistence on stage making a contradiction of modernism, all of which is, you know, taking place, this sexualized interior, behind this banal facade. Obviously, it is an essay as well on the queer status of the subject, in this case, who has a sort of bifurcated existence. And I just want to end with that because while we're rehabilitating and revising our understanding of modern architecture's history by bringing women back into the conversation, I think what I want to do and what I clearly, Mary and Jasmine are also doing is messing that up a little bit, right? Not just saying, and making this very, very important point about the status of the woman architect in a partnership, but going then further to try to see the work that they do and the places in which they're experimenting, the places in which others are paying the bills, as helpful to us in understanding the nature of gender, sexuality, and modern architecture. Thank you.
So first, I would like to just acknowledge and express appreciation for those three fantastic, extraordinarily synthetic presentations. I mean, the amount of material that you put into such short talks was really quite phenomenal and an amazing way to start the conversation. So can I ask you to come up here? So I was scribbling notes, and I have something very much on my mind that I have to say that I think, I don't know if we adequately expressed in the exhibition. It was both overt and maybe more covert. But one of the things that distinguishes Aino from this all of this discussion is what I just wrote down as typology. Because in fact, I think that she, largely due to the Aalto's own status within Finnish modernism at that time, but also within this extraordinary burgeoning modernism in Finland, is a woman who works in many typologies, not just the house, but airport, school, and factory. And the factory, Sunila being, you know, the absolute ultimate example of this, and it ended up being my most obsessed project in the exhibition because of this, the magnitude of the building. So I just wonder, in terms of the various things that you're saying, although they each obviously apply very strongly to the house as a typology, but I wonder with women architects also if you extend the questions outside of that typology, kind of where we go. And I hope that this is something that the exhibition inspires people to think about, because I think that the house has really been a singular focus in the gender discussion, whereas other typologies also.
I think that's a really important point, and I think Aino Aalto really does go beyond that. But I also was struck how she did do nurseries. I felt like she did work at various scales, but I think she also dealt with work commercial spaces, all sorts of things, and probably does say something about Scandinavia, Finland, a range of possibilities there, and maybe the nature of their collaboration as well. There were other women who did, Elizabeth Scott, who did the theater, the Shakespeare Theatre in London, who won a competition. Competitions, by the way, are a great way for women to enter things. Gina Orbach, who designed the whole circle in Tel Aviv, where, if you know the Cinema Hotel, any of you have been to Tel Aviv, important Israeli architect, or the three women who worked in the fair. I think, you know, it is an issue. I always felt like even going to the city was getting out of my little box between chairs and kitchens. But I think we do, because they had such a strong role in the domestic realm and in housing, that we forget too that some women, and Aino Aalto is certainly an example, got beyond that, or besides that.
And I know that Eileen Gray had a few, and if you've read Carolyn Constance's work, right? She had a few designs for vacation centers. I think she had two, and I saw another little model for a third, but they were never realized. And I think a lot of the time it is this question of opportunity, specifically when we're talking about that era and women architects. They may have had great ideas for something beyond individual housing designs, or even, beyond domestic designs, but just weren't really given that opportunity, right?
Any questions from the audience?
I always think of basically that women's design are in everything. It's just that they were ripped off by everyone. Like Corbusier being probably the worst offender. And I mean, I guess it's just really impossible to locate that or find that.
I don't want to defend Corbu, but he did give Charlotte Perriand, he says, in charge of domestic equipment in Précision. He does include her name. MoMA, however, I still remember talking to Terry Riley on the chair label where it had Corbu.
No longer.
I know. So I sometimes, as I said, I'm not so sure people in the 20s and 30s were sometimes as bad as we were post-war. And I remember Gideon in his one edition of A Space Time. I almost think he feels guilty about Aino, because after she dies, he pays this lovely homage to her. But why not before? And I think that historians didn't do women, but there are exceptions. Hildebrandt, Hans Hildebrandt, who was not sure what women did was art, did write a little book about women artists. And Gustav Adolf Platz, his second book, includes a lot of women designers.
It's interesting actually,
Yeah.
Philip Johnson, when he's using the LC4 chaiselong in the architecture room in 1933 in MoMA, he does actually credit. It's only after that Perriand drops off the radar. Not that I'm defending.
No, I believe that, because I'm sure it got presented. Actually, they had it patented, the three of them. Charlotte Perriand was very smart and very tough, and she knew how to keep her money. Even today, the Perriand family gets 1/3 the royalties of all those chairs until the patent wears off, which is soon.
But I think, Mary's right in terms of, at the time, and certainly with the Eameses, Charles always credits Ray. Then sometimes that's taken up by magazines or not. So it's very much the much more social, general attitudes about women and things that you're dealing with, and particularly in the husband-wife one, that assumption that if there's two of them and one's male, then a balance is going to be in things. And so it's really complicated unpicking, because it's shifting and changing all the time. But it seems to me there's often not the partner or that's the key. It's those sort of wider issues. And I was interested in what you were saying about size. You know, the people that really want to go in hard choose things like that, or ugliness, or I mean, there's an incredible range of things to prove that this couldn't have been an equal collaboration. I mean, complete nonsense. But
well, equal is a different story for sure. Yeah. But the acknowledgement of them as a partner. You know, I think that when the people in Finland wanted to establish the Aalto Foundation, giving primary credence to Alvar Aalto had a lot of financial advantages, especially in the royalty situation. It's interesting that the family only retains the rights to her work alone, whereas there's a sharing with the foundation of the rights to Alvar Aalto's work. So this is something which they were clearly less savvy than carry on.
Well, was there another question?
No, that's okay. I'll wait until you're. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so much of it seems to me, so much of what we're talking about is about representation, right? So that the ways in which the history of modernism is, and the polemics of modernism can be fit into existing categories of representation, right? So that the genius of the individual genius is the conventional category. So whatever the reality, we take that and put these partnerships into those. We don't have the capacity, I think, for complex representations. And similarly, you know, with the history of modern architecture, or modernism, which needs to be rewritten in so many different ways, we don't have I don't think we have good categories. And it was only, you know, in my own work on going back and thinking about the women in the making of the modern house as being radical patrons of architecture. Someone said to me, well, they were all gay, right? You know, and I was like, well, actually, none of them are. None of them are out. That's a different piece, right? So that this performance of patronage of modern architecture is something that is done by empowered white women. Is there a question?
Yeah, so there's the statement about the poker-faced house, and then this idea of staying in versus coming out, and the sort of delays to the entrance seem related to me. And I was wondering if any or all of you could speak to how you think about that in terms of opticality, also the language of the X-ray in relation to the glass house. And I guess so maybe if you could further speak about how the interiors are maybe oriented towards other senses, or if there's some kind of thinking around that.
Well, for me, certainly that was what compelled me most, right? When we look at the sort of conventional historiography of modernist architecture, which I love Mary pointing out that that's really not necessarily what people were interested in at the time, or the ways in which people were framing their work necessarily, but the way it gets written about afterwards is this real emphasis on a kind of, although Le Corbusier was quite adamant about this vista and a certain kind of availability to vision and a certain visual.
But he did a lot of poker face buildings.
But he did poker-faced buildings too. So
yeah,
I
think
like
it
this
gets
very much.
complicated. Think of Plain X, Garsh even.
Yeah, and especially his later work too.
Well, there are a lot of poker face buildings.
But those examples say something. Right?
And I would say that one of his more public buildings, like La Roche, is for a gay bachelor. I think it gets very complicated.
And this is where I think it really
And I would actually argue that his houses invite unconventional relationships. If it's a menage a trois, like Michael Stein, even if it's not sexual, I don't know what the relationship between the three of them was. Or a gay bachelor like La Roche, we assume he's gay, it's hard to know. They are very painters. I couldn't categorize, and I even wondered about the Kaufman house. Edgar Jr. was the spirit behind it, and he was as gay as you could be. So how did we put this all together?
I know that for me, the thing that was really intriguing about all of the women that I was looking at was that they were all interested in these kind of delayed accesses. And I think Ray more so than anyone, and perhaps because she actually built a couple of houses. And so the things that compelled me was this kind of prolonged threshold. And she wrote very little, but what she did write about was deferring visual access and engaging bodies in a way that was going to prioritize a sort of sentient relationship to a space than above a visual access to a space. And, you know, so I read it within a kind of visual economy of gender at the time where there was an increasing emphasis on feminized modernity as stripping, which we can see, it, you know, continues to be an interesting thing when we talk about Islamophobia and the threat to femininity, it seems, that is made by covering. But so at this time there was a particular emphasis on exposure, and I think Ray was like, okay, I would be interested in not exposure. And, you know, and kind of interrupting a certain kind of agenda of clarity and communication that starts to be compelling at the time for a whole bunch of people. All these women were like, not so much. I'd like to step away and step back. So within Eileen Gray's houses, she has all of these, you know, extended entrances into rooms and into spaces, so that, you know, in E1027, there's, you know, you can see it in the actual plan of the house. When you enter a room, you know, you're faced by a wall, and then you turn again and you're faced by, you know, another wall, and you have to turn and be physically enmeshed within a room before you have access to that room, rather than just opening a door and there's the vista, right? And so she was doing a lot of that sort of work within her buildings, but then, you know, you see within other people's designs there was a kind of emphasis on delaying the object itself, or delaying access to, and that became particularly interesting in my research.
I think, so the question is, what is the public identity, not what's the private identity? Mm-hmm. So I think what the Glass House Guest House pairing is about in many ways is the contradiction for Edgar Jr. and the contradiction for LaRoche, right? That they, you know, as they're not, that's not the identity that they're projecting. They're projecting an identity as patron of modern architecture, as with the guest house, as with the Glass House. And that Johnson's contribution is to say, well, there's this other thing that can be spatially articulated as well. So I'm interested in what you think of that idea, because, you know, I think it's hard to figure out, but you know, we obviously have this divide of gender that puts the categories of houses that are for these single men, or for men, built by men, or built by power couples, as quite separate, I think, from the categories of houses that are built for single women. Single women who inhabit this world in a way that Farnsworth doesn't, of a kind of gay demi-monde, or whatever you want to call it, right? A world that's intentionally private and articulated through the kind of screening of vision, right? But that what happens with Falling Water and what happens with the LaRoche house is the same as what would happen with the Glass House, I think, were it not for the guest house. And does that make any sense?
Yeah, what I liked a lot about what Jasmine, this fluidity thing, I just think modernism itself breaks down those categories, and it does it in different ways, in different situations. And I'm not even sure, like, I think a Roby house is pretty hard to get into. Maybe someone else has another
I was going
point.
to say, in talking about this, I was just looking at taking in the broader context that modernism was basically an answer to the Victorian structure that was, you know, compartmentalized. So in itself, regardless of the man or the woman who's designing it, that was the overall arching plan, right, for the most part, to open things up. But then, you know, maybe you're missing that little privacy, that door that leads somewhere else. So it may just be that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, because something that you were used to is now changed, but then you remember how much you liked it, or didn't, you know, or found it comforting. So.
And that actually reflects Eileen Gray's essay in some ways. It's a very tempered modernism where you're allowed doubt. And I think you have a very good point, but I do think that thing of challenging the kind of categories of bourgeois conventions and Victorian houses and figurative references to gender, sometimes they get reinstated. I mean, we think of Mises furniture in the 50s as corporate male, and you look at Lily Reich's coverings, Rosemary always, I think it's here still, I don't know. I was shocked when she first told me about how colorful the Tugendhat house coverings were and things like that. And I had seen all those black and white photos, and Mies was about as male as you could get to me. And suddenly I realized, maybe due to Lily Reich, but it was a much more complicated thing.
It's interesting that the club armchairs, the Breuer ones, and the photo in the exhibition, one of the most widely published of Aalto's in their own house, actually has red canvas, because I found the order form. So also in a lot of those Breuer chairs that we see published in architecture magazines were colored too. So this is really something that, you know, that we talked about this.
Yeah, I have a question that goes back to this this question of transparency, which I think Alice really brought up, but seems to have come through a little bit. And I guess I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I guess it's about that modernism there seems to be a lot of these reinscribing of bourgeois norms, but it seems at the same time to be kind of idealist in the sense of transparency is such a great idea, but it's only a great idea if we're actually socially at the same place, where the idea of exposing everyone to everything is great, because this assumes that no one has anything to hide or wants to hide anything. And then we see that transparency in practice is actually kind of a kind of violence, right? That it does violence to those who can't be exposed for whatever reason, because modern society isn't allowing that, right? So I feel as though it points to something bigger about modernism that really, in one sense, wants to be this avant-garde ideal, but in another sense keeps kind of folding back on itself. And I feel like I'm hearing that in various ways from all of you.
And often architects try to do more than one thing, too. I mean, I think that really good architecture can be very complex and can be spectacular and still give privacy. I have too much Corbu in my mind right now, and probably in my life. But he always talked about a room where you could go alone, a sort of private cell that he wanted people to have to escape to be alone. And it may be very different than Eileen Gray's kind of privacy, but I think I think you're right to say that it's complex and that things get reinscribed. But I also think architects sometimes try to do several things simultaneously. Like Darsh, I would say, is poker-faced on the front and quite open on the back. And I think we could give other examples. Even Eileen Gray's house, E1027, there's a solarium. There's a place to kind of expose yourself. And the water side is not as public as the Tugendhat garden side, but it's open.
It strikes a pretty pose.
Yeah.
It's a good-looking facade
Yeah.
on one side of it. But for me, the question of transparency is something that is beyond necessarily an architectural use or mobilization of transparency, as it was a particular kind of theory of communication and theory of dwelling and theory of urbanity and theory of kind of modern subjectivity within a particular period of time, right? When there was an increasing interest in mobility, automobility, steam mobility, the kind of mobility around the world that was bringing into closer communication all of these different locales, but also an explosion of print media, and an increasing availability and popular culture of film. And so all of these things was creating this kind of, sort of frenzy around the concept of immediate accessibility. and transparency of meaning, transparency of objects, availability and access to objects. And this was I mean, for me these days, and part of the thing that I'm trying to work on in my book with my collaborator over there, T.L. Cowan, is the way that we can track some of that to digital cultures right now. And so the kind of compulsion towards open access and open accessibility, and especially around queer archives, queer and trans feminist archives, and this kind of like, well, okay, we could put it online, and so, this happens around like, most recently the book, the series On Our Backs, which was like this lesbian porn from the 80s and 90s, has been put online. And it's like, well, that's great, because now it's openly available, but it's like, is absolute transparency and immediate access really what we're going for? And so these are some of the things we're thinking about, what we can learn from early 20th century designers and this sort of realm of sapphic modernity to bring into thinking through visual cultural protocols within internet spaces.
I have to just mention that one of the things when you were showing the photographs of the women, that there's, of course, a similarity of dress, and it's quite masculine, but it's also very closed in. I mean, not one of them shows their body in any overt way. I mean, they are sometimes buttoned up all the way to the neck. So, where is the opacity and transparency there, just in their whole identity of self through their dress?
And different than Perriand, who shows off her legs and her arms and celebrates a certain kind of freedom in dress.
Right, and in a way, they are the absolute antithesis in that dress of what was identified as the dress of the modern woman, which was much more Perriand, at least in the German context, I think Freya might.
That's precisely the thing,
Interesting.
Actually, I was just struck today reading about Norman Hartnell's archive, and the person there was writing about his private cross-dressing with very elaborate, beautifully coutured dressing up clothes, as she was talking about it, but obviously within particularly enclosed spaces, and that's why I think this brick house really, the two of those things together, and actually she talks about a photograph, and we haven't seen any yet really here, of Hartnell actually on a bed wearing certain of these things with the gardenia or the carnation or whatever it is, and then says something like, but I can't show this, but here's a picture like this, so you see the bedroom, but and it was just so tantalizing, because you were almost going to get something of the performativity that you were kind of trying to get to in a period, of illegality, really, that hasn't come up tonight. It was, that you almost do need brick walls around it and things. But that also just seemed to me that, you're talking about all this transparency, but it's also the period of, the colonial revival, neo-Georgian or whatever. So, and Mary's right, the Nyling Grey House, you have all these labyrinthine ways in, but you have the same sort of semi-exposure, or that there's a bathroom behind a screen or something, and so I think many of these spaces actually are more complex, and Johnson does it in 2 bits.
And with Johnson, of course, getting into the compound was a private, I got yelled at and screamed at when I was a graduate student trying to sneak into the property. So there was another kind of privacy. Yes, it was a glass house, but it was a glass house in a very private enclave. I don't know, that brick thing gives me the willies. And I found the most mundane reading books, and it looked like sort of, I thought Johnson was supposed to be a major intellect, and I found like low-grade bestsellers all over the walls in the guest house, and I don't know what it is, and maybe it's maybe I have homophobia or something, but I just found this really creepy space, and maybe it's because I need a window.
Well, it looks like a public bathroom.
Yeah.
Like a cruising space for men.
Brian, I think
Yeah, Brian Kerr.
what's so interesting about this conversation is there's privacy, and then there's the secret and of the closet, right? We really haven't talked about that.
Well, and Urbach writes that wonderful essay about the closet and his ambivalences almost about getting rid of the closet, what was lost and what was gained in this world that a little like that sort of ambiguous kind of private exploration that could happen in the closet. And I don't know if you all know that essay. It was in Assemblage. It's really fascinating.
Yes, it's really good. But, I keep coming back to this idea of the privacy of the bourgeois subject, right? The bourgeois subject to develop requires privacy. But that's, in a way, that's to be expected, that's to be championed by architecture. And I think the questions that I keep returning to are these questions of what can't be shown, right? What architecturally cannot be shown for a variety of reasons, economic being one of them, but of the notion of architectural shame. I love this idea of Garsh as a poker face because, of course, in one interpretation it is, right? It screens, and in some ways, Tampapaya screens, and that makes it problematic, right, in terms of Gray's oeuvre, which has a lot to do with these lacquer screens and these interiors, embedded, secret, closet-like interiors, right? But Garsh, to me, is more interesting in it, it's more interesting as a program that makes possible a certain kind of architectural articulation, but no part of it seems to me to be, there's no shame involved in Garsh, right? So it really isn't a poker face. It's a screen, a bourgeois screen, entirely photogenic, right? You can't get a more photographed or photogenic facade.
I think we should also remember that I think Gray spent a lot of time in both of those houses with a man.
I mean,
His
I
name happens to have
actually,
been Jean-Baptiste.
I have a whole question for Jasmine, which is later.
This is
If
another.
you would make a distinction between E1027 and Tempe Pai, because it was a house, a gift for a man, a present to a man.
These are some complicated claims that are being made, that when we start to say that it was a gift for a man and all of this sort of stuff, there is no historical evidence for that. We assume it was, but we don't know that it was.
We do know that it was a gift for him.
How do we know it was a gift for him?
Well, she very much left it to him.
But one could say from her own archives that she left it because she started to feel crowded out, because she started to hate the amount of sociality that was going on in the house. She didn't like having to share the house with all the guests.
So she left it rather than gave it.
We know so little about
We know so
Badavici
little.
and Gray,
That's it.
and I don't think you can generalize too much, but it's a very different kind of house than her later
Absolutely.
house.
And for me, I want to sort of say that at the time, again, when we're thinking about privacy and kind of bourgeois claims to privacy and a bourgeois articulation of subjectivity through its claims to privacy, at the time, women's claims to privacy was already a massive revolutionary statement. Virginia Woolf wrote A Room of One's Own in 1928, right, where the possibility of creative thinking was predicated on the capacity to close a door and have your own room. These women were making a radical statement in being able to say, I would like to have a claim to privacy. And so we can imagine that, modernist architecture and its investment in an open space and open plans was fantastic for a lot of people, but not necessarily for the inhabitations that were embodied through femininity that were never able to claim a space to go think for yourself. And that in fact at the time, when a woman made a claim to private space, she was masculinized to the extent that she was read as perverted, as an invert, as having sexual and gender dysphorias. So So this is also something about, right, what, just the simple thing of private space for women was like, what? This was making a massive claim to gender transgression. And
I'm
a major
afraid
intervention.
Yeah.
Out of
We could be
time.
all over the place.
But thank you.